Hi everyone and welcome to our presentation about Interlanguage for the Applied Linguistics course. My name is Joana Alvarado and my classmates' names are Chiara Corpus and Maria Ruiz. On this presentation we are going to talk about Interlanguage, its definitions, characteristics, some proposals and concepts such as fossilization. And finally some samples from 3 different English students whose first language is Spanish. To contextualize you a little bit, let me tell you that Interlanguage belongs to the field of applied psycholinguistics, which investigates about processes and structures underlying the acquisition and usage of a second language, L2, or a foreign language, FL. Interlanguage is a dynamic linguistic system developed by second language learners who are in the process of learning a L2 or a target language LM. In other words, Interlanguage is a linguistic system used by non-native speakers to communicate ideas in a second language. But due to the grammatical and phonetical gaps in their knowledge of L2, they rely on rules of the first language or mother language. Therefore, this interlanguage system is made up of characteristics of the first language L1, other languages, in case that the learner has mastered any other language, and characteristics of L2. An example of this phenomenon is when a person whose first language is Spanish and is learning English. At the time he or she has to speak or write, which are the outputs, and the person has not mastered his second language, he or she will intend to express ideas using the language of his or her mother language, or L1. Some of the proposals about interlanguage are made by Selinker, who talks about Latin language structure, which is a structure responsible for the acquisition of the mother language L1. And according to Lambert, this structure stopped working at puberty. Selinker proposed that around 95% of the students who have reached puberty start activating a new structure called Latin psychological structure in order to acquire an L2, and therefore they will develop an interlanguage. The characteristics of the Latin psychological structure are that they do not have a genetic calendar, they do not have a direct relation with the universal grammar, and this structure is not for sure going to become a natural language. And finally, it's possible that it overlaps another intellectual structures. The development of the interlanguage has 5 linguistic central processes. The first one is linguistic transference, when we use the rule of a language different to the L2, usually the rules of our L1. Training transference, when the interlanguage is the result of the usage of didactic procedures on the L2 teaching. The learning strategies of L2 is the one that you use when for the characteristics of the interlanguage are the result of the resources or cognitive processes used by learners in order to learn an L2. Communication strategies happens when the learner tries to compensate his limited linguistic competence when communicating. And finally, overgeneralization, when the characteristics of interlanguage come from the overgeneralizations of rule to be applied on an L2 context. Corder maintained that at this point in the learning of a target language, learners use a system that can be described in linguistic terms and from which the researcher can discover the learner's traditional competence. This system can be illustrated by the systematic errors of the learner as opposed to random mistakes. From this point of view, errors are not seen as indicators of failure to learn the target language, but are regarded positively as evidence that the learner is actually involved in testing hypotheses about the linguistic system of the language that is being acquired. Corder also proposed the term of borrowing. which is when the learner uses the elements of a known language, usually this is L1, to compensate and get over linguistic deficiencies, and when he or she communicates on L2. Some of the characteristics of the interlanguage are the errors, mistakes, or wrongly formed sentences, which indicates the linguistic competence of the students, the strategy used in the development of L2, and the formation of the learner's own hypothesis. Within the most important classifications of errors are the ones made by Richards in 1971, who mentions 3 types of errors. The first one are interlingual errors, those which are identified as interference of their known language for the learner. Usually those errors come from his mother language. The intra-language errors is due to the use of strategies over generalization and simplification, and development errors, which is similar to the ones made by children learning L1, where the errors disappear after some time of the acquisition process. Fossilizations is basically the process that occurs when incorrect linguistic features become a permanent part of the way of a person speaks or writes a language. There are a variety of factors causing fossilization. Nearly all errors can lead to the emergence of fossilization. The most fundamental cause is that the foreign language learners are not able to acquire both functions and forms in natural language contact. Remember that interlanguage is a language system that the learner constructs out of the linguistic data to which they have been exposed. A linguistic form of structure is not part of the learner's interlanguage at a given stage or point in time in subsequent stages. This implication of this is that the acquisition of a given form, as expressed by its presence or absence in the learner's language, should be understood as irrefutable evidence of the existence of a sequence of stages in the acquisition of features in the target language. Interlanguage can be considered as a linguistic system because its part relates itself to a particular set of rules that are not determinate, but it can be intuited. Interlanguage sample
Task
1.
2. What have you done in your life that made feel proud? Well, in my life, I make too many things that made me feel proud, but if I need to say only 1 or 2, I'm going to say without thinking too much that the most important and what made me feel so proud every day is my family, my 2 beautiful daughters, and my amazing husband. I have the most wonderful family, and that is what makes me feel so proud.
As you can see, this sample was called Task 2. What have you done in your life that makes you proud? In this example, it was taken from a private class, and as you can see, this student is in the basic stage of pronunciation, and you could say that she is a beginner student. The student's L1 is Spanish, And given that Spanish is a strong phonetic language, you can notice that most of the errors in the sample are the pronunciations of some words. And since she pronounced them as if she was reading from Spanish. Also, in her pronunciation, she has different timings and different punctuations and different stresses on the words. Students at this stage tend to speak slow and with long pauses between words. For example, she said, I going, when the right one will be I am going. But this is a common error for Spanish speakers, since in Spanish the words I means yo and going, voy, are correctly used, but in English it needs the verb to be in order to make sense. Also, we can see in the minute 102 that the students say daughters when she meant daughter. Phonetically in Spanish would be correctly said, but this is tricky because at this stage, because she needs to start learning how to pronounce properly, but she will get there. If the student doesn't know the phonetics of certain words, they will tend to speak as they write the whole life. But we as the teachers, we have to tell them nicely how to correct these mistakes. If the students are not corrected, they will fossilize this information and keep saying words phonetically incorrect. This is our second sample. This is from an intermediate high level student whose first language is Spanish and is learning English. Here you can see some of the mistakes. This is her diary made on an exercise of what she used to do every day. So we have examples like this one. At 9:30 we went to the rental car for return the car. So we have like a literal translation from her first language, Spanish. Later we can see here Anna called to our mother. So we don't have the need from the two, right? Also, Anna called to our mother and we spoke with she. Here also we have again this problem of for. In Spanish, the translation of this for will be por, which could be translated as for or to. Here she keeps translated as for. In general, her other samples were given the same idea. As you can see through it, you will find that she has a pretty good idea of the structure, but she still has some small mistakes that come from her mother language. In this third sample, you can see that, well, we can notice that the student is making literal translations based on her mother language. We can also notice that she used words in her mother language instead of the second language she's acquired. So, for example, let me highlight or point out to you. For example, here we have 18 years, so will be I am 18 years old. We have this one actualmente, which we currently, I believe, studying technologies in accounting and finance. And it will be maybe I'm finishing my school stage and started the production stage. Now here in Bogota, you can see in general the structure of the whole paragraph. First, it doesn't have punctuation, and second, it has translation. Like you can see the structure, the rules of the grammatical structure of this paragraph comes from Spanish. As teachers, we cannot base our ideas in thinking that she's making errors as something wrong, but that she's using her first language, which is Spanish, in order to acquire the second language, which is English. Errors are valuable indicators of what goes on the internalized linguistic system or competence of the learner, and can help the the teaching process, and it helps us to identify areas that she is having some trouble with and to check what is her level of the acquisition of her grammar. Usually these we could say mistakes, we can see them in the grammar or in the spoken language because it's the output. So at the beginner, as this student was in a basic course of English, we can see that she still mix the grammar of English and with the grammar of Spanish in order to give us an example for this class. These were our references. Thank you so much for watching our video. I hope you really enjoy it and that you can take advantage of our presentation. I apologize for any shortcoming and I hope to hear from you. Thank you.